I want to get into an international debate over energy that is just heating up. It's a debate we're seeing play out in our own backyard too, at California's last remaining nuclear plant, the Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant.
A coalition of scientists, academics, and clean energy advocates are fighting to keep it operational.
The governor is keeping all options on the table to ensure a reliable power grid.
After decades of shutting down nuclear plants across the country, suddenly we're seeing a growing political movement to hit the brakes, and much of it is led by environmental scientists. At first glance, this might seem a little puzzling, given how unpopular nuclear energy has been historically. A study from the Pew Research Center found that nuclear power was barely more popular than coal and oil among the US public. Vast majorities of respondents were instead in favor of increasing wind and solar energy intake. Despite this, the Biden administration announced $6 billion to keep current nuclear plants operational, and Governor Newsom is now pushing to keep Diablo Canyon open. So, what's going on here? How has the debate around nuclear energy changed? And why are we seeing this sudden shift for a less popular energy source? First, let's take a look at how the US and international community at large became so anti-nuclear to begin with.
Against the dark background of the atomic bomb, the United States does not wish merely to present strength, but also the desire and the hope for peace.
Nuclear power plants began springing up around the country in the post-war period, encouraged by President Eisenhower, seen here making his famous Atoms for Peace speech at the UN. But that wasn't enough to calm the fears of nuclear armament and attacks as the US headed into the Cold War. Nuclear power plants depend on fuel rods where fission occurs, or in other words, splitting an atom. The rods are surrounded by water, which helps keep them cool. The fission creates heat, which boils the surrounding water to make steam, and the steam is what powers a turbine to make energy. If, for some reason, the fuel rods get too hot, that can cause a meltdown. In 1979, the first major accident happened at a US power plant. The 3 Mile Island incident was a partial meltdown of a plant in Pennsylvania where cleanup took over 20 years. Conflicting studies haven't conclusively determined whether the disaster led to health problems, such as a rise in cancer in the area, but the image was already set in the public's mind. The number of nuclear plants being built and kept open plummeted. Further high-profile disasters made a lasting impact worldwide. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster in the Soviet Union had horrific and deadly consequences. Then, in 2011, the Fukushima plant meltdown only added to the list, even though there were no reported deaths. These disasters also reinforced national security concerns about plants being potential targets of terrorist groups.
Thousands of utilities, chemical plants, nuclear plants, all being told they could be Al-Qaeda targets.
Or wartime enemies like Russia and Ukraine.
Global alarm over explosions at Europe's largest nuclear power plant, now operating under Russian control.
Це найбільша атомна станція на нашому континенті, і будь-які обстріли цього об'єкту – це відвертий, зухвалий злочин, акт терору.
So how does this pro-nuclear movement grow now after decades of such an uneasy legacy? There are a number of things that have happened in recent years. Safer technology is being developed for future facilities, and now that China and Russia have overtaken the US in the number of nuclear plants, there are new concerns about being energy independent. But one of the biggest reasons for the recent shift is climate change. Nuclear power is still crucial to our energy grid. It still generates about 20% of the US electricity supply, and it's the single largest non-fossil energy source in the US and second globally. Advocates say nuclear is going to be essential in order to meet emission goals in the fight against climate change. Nuclear is what's known as a firm energy source, meaning it's always able to meet demand and produce energy. Renewables like wind and solar may also be clean, but are limited by things like the weather or time of year. So the infrastructure needed for solar and wind energy to match nuclear's output just can't be built fast enough to quickly replace both fossil fuels and nuclear. As a result, nuclear often just gets replaced by fossil fuels, as we've seen in cases from plant closures in New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and more. There's no easy solution when it comes to nuclear power, and as the country races to meet its emissions goals, it seems clear that existing nuclear power plants will be a part of the strategy in some way. Back in California at the Diablo Canyon plant, the governor announced last week plans to keep the plant open for another 5 to 10 years. The plant's scheduled closing date was 2025. Governor Newsom plans to use federal funds as a loan to the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, which provides energy to millions of households in California to keep the facility running. And the US isn't alone in rethinking plant closures. Many parts of Europe are also rethinking nuclear energy, both as countries race to meet climate goals and as they struggle with an energy crisis spurred by the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And some of these major sudden policy reversals could unfold as early as this fall. Our correspondent Rosie Burchard in Brussels has more on how this debate is playing out there. Rosie, what are we seeing in EU countries right now?
Christian, this has been a summer of drought, of wildfires, of heat waves here in Europe, but officials are trying to plan ahead for a much colder winter. Now, new energy import deals have been agreed with suppliers seen as more reliable, including the United States, but that's simply not enough to plug this gap, and that's why the nuclear option is really moving up the agenda for some countries here in Europe. Now, Berlin is said to be considering a major policy U-turn, so postponing the life of its last 3 nuclear plants. Now, that would require approval from German lawmakers because it's really a marked departure from the previous policy laid out by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, former German Chancellor, taken in the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster, when Chancellor Merkel decided to try and phase out nuclear power entirely. It's also very politically sensitive in Germany because the country's Green Party, now a key coalition partner, was really in many ways born out of the anti-nuclear movement. But we see similar moves elsewhere in Europe. Here in Belgium, the government has also opted to extend the life of some of its nuclear plants instead of shutting them down. Meanwhile, other countries are really digging in their heels. Austria and Luxembourg are fierce critics of nuclear power. They cite concerns about waste storage and past disasters, and they vowed to take the EU's executive to court over a decision earlier this year to grant a sustainable investment label to nuclear activities. France, meanwhile, remains staunchly pro-nuclear. Christian, back to you.